June of 1940 opened like a verdict over the Atlantic. The sea that once carried the trade lifeblood of the British Empire now resembled a graveyard of twisted steel, drifting cargo and black smoke rising against a gray horizon. In only 4 months after the fall of France, more than 1 million tons of British shipping had vanished beneath the waves. Some weeks recorded over 40 merchant ships lost. Every new tally placed on the wall of the Admiralty War Room felt less like statistics and more like a pulse slowly fading. Across the ocean, in Washington, the Federal Reserve reported a figure that chilled the cabinet more than any battlefield loss. Britain possessed foreign currency reserves sufficient for only 3 more months of imports. Without those imports, the United Kingdom would starve long before its armies ran out of ammunition. The logic of war had become the logic of finance. Convoys were no longer just steel hulls and cargo. They were a measure of Britain's remaining time. President Franklin Roosevelt received these numbers in a room that was always too quiet for a world collapsing so loudly. He stood between 2 irresistible pressures. The law of the United States demanded neutrality. The fate of the Atlantic demanded intervention. Yet the simplest truth lay in the report stacked before him. The trade routes of the Western world were failing. No empire can survive when its arteries clog. Outside the capital, queues grew at docks as shipping companies argued over insurance rates that had risen to impossible levels. American reporters wrote cautiously about the crisis, but everyone understood what the numbers meant. 3 out of every 10 ships leaving British ports never reached their destination. Every lost vessel carried not just food and raw materials, but the credibility of an empire fighting alone. Roosevelt moved from report to map. The lines stretching from Halifax to Liverpool looked like veins feeding a body under siege. If they broke, the war would not simply shift, it would end. Yet he was trapped by a contradiction that held the entire nation hostage. The United States wished to remain neutral, but the neutrality it clung to was sinking at the same rate as British tonnage. He asked himself a question that had no precedent in American history. How do you save an ocean without entering the war that is drowning it? In the late summer of 1940, Washington was a city divided by fear that no one admitted aloud. The crisis in the Atlantic was visible to every official, yet the idea that the United States might intervene even indirectly was treated as political heresy. Economists circulated memoranda warning that Britain's financial position was deteriorating at a pace unprecedented in modern commerce. British spending in the United States had burned through nearly all available reserves, leaving doubts about whether the island nation could remain a solvent customer for even a few more weeks. Within Congress, the mood bordered on hostility. Members of the isolationist bloc argued that the Atlantic was not an American responsibility, and that any move to assist Britain would drag the nation toward a war it did not choose. In their view, Britain was a distant empire that had mismanaged its obligations. They framed the crisis not as a shared challenge of the Western world, but as the consequence of imperial overreach. Their confidence was reinforced by polls showing that a majority of Americans opposed sending military aid abroad in any form. Newspapers amplified the skepticism. Editorials dismissed the rumor that Roosevelt was considering transferring aging warships as reckless fantasy. Commentators insisted that the United States could not afford to weaken its own naval readiness, especially with the Pacific situation growing uncertain. They cited figures from the Navy Department showing only a little more than 100 modern destroyers available for active duty. The suggestion of giving away almost half that number sounded not merely irresponsible, but irrational. Foreign observers joined the chorus of doubt. Some advisors from neutral states predicted that Britain's remaining purchasing power would evaporate before winter. Bankers in South America and Europe began demanding stricter terms for credit, as if the collapse of British finances were an inevitability rather than a threat. Inside the Washington policy circles, the tone grew increasingly cynical. The idea of exchanging outdated American destroyers for access to British bases was mocked in private meetings. Critics argued that no strategic advantage could justify the perceived surrender of American neutrality. They described the notion as a desperate gesture dressed up as diplomacy. Yet beneath the skepticism, an unspoken truth unsettled the capital. All the traditional answers had already failed. What remained was a question few wanted to confront. Was the refusal to act a safeguard of national interest or the beginning of a much greater loss? The idea that would later be called destroyers for bases did not appear in a moment of inspiration. It emerged from months of accumulating signals, each pointing to a single conclusion. The Atlantic crisis was not only a naval disaster, but a structural collapse of strategy itself. In the quiet rooms of Washington, Roosevelt studied reports that revealed how deeply British survival was intertwined with forces far beyond the battlefield. The United Kingdom depended on overseas imports for the majority of its essential supplies, and the collapse of its purchasing power threatened to unravel not merely a war effort, but an entire economic system built over centuries. For Roosevelt, these were not abstract numbers. He had watched the same dynamic during the Great Depression, when the invisible flows of credit determined whether nations endured or broke apart. Now he saw the British crisis through the same lens. An empire that once commanded global trade was reduced to bargaining for time measured not in years or months, but in the slow depletion of bank accounts and insurance guarantees. One detail kept returning in cabinet discussions. The United States possessed a reserve of destroyers built during the final years of the previous World War. Dozens had been mothballed, their steel weathered, their engines aging but functional. They represented a forgotten inheritance, obsolete by American standards, yet potentially priceless for a nation struggling to cover the vast distances of the Atlantic. No one had imagined they would matter again. They were remnants of an earlier conflict, shadows from a war the world had promised never to repeat. At the same time, American military planners studied maps of the Caribbean and the North Atlantic with growing anxiety. The strategic arc stretching from Newfoundland to British Guiana covered a zone the United States had long regarded as part of its natural defense. If hostile powers ever secured bases in those waters, the consequences would alter the balance of the entire Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt understood that the fall of Britain would not simply shift colonial borders. It would expose the coastline of the United States to threats no administration had ever had to contemplate. The convergence of these two realities created a paradox. Britain needed ships. America needed security. Both lacked the political freedom to pursue their needs openly. It was in this tension that a new kind of diplomacy began to form, one that treated warships not as instruments of battle, but as currency, and bases not as territory, but as insurance. Roosevelt sensed that the crisis demanded more than caution. It demanded a form of reasoning that reached beyond the familiar boundaries of neutrality. No formal alliance existed between the two nations, yet the logic of the moment made the alternatives shrink day by day. Out of these calculations emerged a question that carried the weight of history. Could an exchange of assets, one born from necessity rather than tradition, become the line that prevented the Atlantic from collapsing entirely? Before the exchange of destroyers and bases became a path forward, Roosevelt explored every conventional option available to him, only to watch each one fail under the weight of law, politics, and time. The earliest attempts centered on financial rescue. British officials quietly sought ways to purchase American ships outright, offering gold shipments and the remnants of their overseas investments as collateral. Yet every proposal collided with the same legal wall. The neutrality statutes of the United States forbade the sale of military equipment to nations at war. Even the most imaginative legal advisors could not twist the restrictions into something usable. Efforts to create alternative arrangements fared no better. When British negotiators suggested leasing Caribbean airfields in return for financial concessions, American policymakers hesitated. The plan lacked immediacy. Britain did not need access to land. It needed seaworthy hulls, trained crews, and the ability to escort trade routes already shrinking by the week. Leasing airfields was a gesture. Saving convoys required force. The mismatch between what Britain offered and what Britain needed revealed a truth everyone already feared. Time was slipping faster than diplomacy could move. Meanwhile, American insurers and shipping executives faced pressures of their own. The risk calculations for Atlantic trade had shifted so sharply that some carriers refused to operate without premiums bordering on extortionate. As rates soared, even neutral trade with Europe began to falter. The economic arteries of the hemisphere were tightening, and the logic was brutal. Trade that could not be protected would not continue. Roosevelt watched this development with concern. An ocean without commerce was not a moat, it was a void. Inside the British Admiralty, the mood grew tense. Engineers reported that escort vessels waiting for repair were stacking up at shipyards that lacked manpower and materials. Every additional delay increased the vulnerability of convoys already stretched to their limits. Officers wrote in private correspondence that the crisis was no longer linear. It was exponential. A single failed week could undermine an entire month of planning. Amid these failures, a rare opportunity appeared. The United States Department of Justice issued an opinion that older American destroyers, classified as surplus material, could potentially be transferred without violating existing statutes. It was a narrow interpretation and carried political risk, but it was the first opening that did not close immediately. This slender loophole offered something the previous attempts lacked, a path that matched British urgency with American legality. For the first time in months, a faint sense of possibility entered rooms that had grown accustomed to disappointment. The question was no longer whether action was necessary. It was whether Washington had the courage to follow the single thread that had not yet snapped. In the final days of August 1940, the narrow legal opening identified by the Department of Justice transformed from a technical note into the foundation of a bold diplomatic maneuver. Roosevelt moved quietly, aware that any premature disclosure would ignite opposition capable of destroying the plan before it was born. He convened a small circle of advisors from the Navy, the State Department, and the legal office, asking each of them the same question. Could the United States transfer aging destroyers without violating the neutrality statutes, and could it justify the action as a measure of national defense rather than intervention? Their answers were cautious but aligned. The law did not forbid the exchange if the vessels were classified as surplus, and if the transaction could be framed as an augmentation of American security. From that point, the steps unfolded with deliberate precision. Naval officers compiled the list of 50 destroyers that could be made serviceable with minimal effort. Lawyers drafted the language that would define the transfer not as a sale, but as an exchange of assets between sovereign states. A transaction designed to strengthen the stability of the Western Hemisphere. Diplomats prepared communication channels to London, where Churchill, exhausted yet determined, understood the stakes with absolute clarity. For Britain, these ships represented more than numbers. They were the difference between holding the Atlantic line or watching it collapse. On the second day of September, the agreement was announced. The United States would transfer 50 destroyers to the United Kingdom, while receiving 99-year access to a chain of strategic bases stretching from Newfoundland to British Guiana. The terms were practical, but the symbolism was profound. Bases gave the United States geographic reach it had never possessed. Destroyers gave Britain the breathing room it desperately needed. When the news reached London, the reaction was a mixture of relief and urgency. The vessels were not modern, and many required work, but they could be deployed quickly. Naval engineers began preparations for refits, and officers mapped out which convoys would receive new escorts first. For the men assigned to sail them, the ships felt like lifelines disguised as relics. In Washington, the political response was immediate. Isolationist voices denounced the agreement as a betrayal of neutrality, accusing Roosevelt of setting the nation on a path toward war. Yet beneath the noise, a quieter understanding began to take shape. The United States had not sent soldiers or fired a shot, but it had altered the geometry of the conflict. The transfer marked more than a transaction. It marked a declaration of strategic intent, conducted without the formality of an alliance. By binding American security to the survival of the Atlantic routes, Roosevelt had changed the trajectory of the war. The ocean that had been sinking under the weight of crisis now held a new center of gravity, and the world could feel the shift. The agreement did more than move ships across an ocean. It reshaped how American leaders understood power in a global conflict. For decades, the United States had imagined security as a wall built along its coastlines. The Atlantic crisis exposed the illusion. Defense was no longer a matter of distance. It was a matter of infrastructure, finance, and control over the strategic arteries that linked continents. Roosevelt saw what many of his critics could not. To protect the nation, the United States had to redefine the geography of safety. Access to the new chain of bases extended American reach across waters long considered distant. Aircraft could now operate far into the North Atlantic and the Caribbean, expanding patrol zones beyond anything previously possible. It was an evolution of strategy. The United States did not need to join the war to influence it. It needed only to position itself where the outcome could be shaped. By securing the bases, Roosevelt turned the Atlantic from a passive frontier into an active sphere of American oversight. This shift was accompanied by a deeper transformation in economic thinking. The crisis made clear that the distinction between financial stability and military strength had dissolved. An empire could not fight if it could not trade, and it could not trade if it could not safeguard the routes that sustained it. Roosevelt and his advisors understood that resources, markets, production, and credit formed a single ecosystem. Protecting one meant protecting all. Within American industry, this realization triggered changes that would later define the wartime economy. Shipyards began planning expansions. Manufacturers explored ways to increase output should demands rise. Banks evaluated how credit could be structured to support foreign partners without breaching domestic law. These were early signs of a new doctrine that linked economic capacity to global responsibility. It suggested that the strength of the United States would no longer be measured solely by its borders, but by its ability to sustain the networks that kept the Western world functioning. The exchange of destroyers for bases thus became the opening chapter of a broader transformation. It introduced a foreign policy built on assets rather than alliances, on logistics rather than rhetoric. It hinted at the coming age in which the United States would act not only as a participant in world affairs, but as an architect of their structure. What began as a legal workaround evolved into a philosophy. Security was no longer a shield, it was a system. By early 1942, the consequences of the exchange were no longer theoretical. They could be measured in patrol logs, convoy arrivals, and the widening gap between German expectations and reality. The destroyers transferred under the agreement had undergone refits. Their aging frames strengthened, their sonar improved, and their armaments adjusted for the brutal demands of escort duty. 28 of them were now operating across the North Atlantic, forming a backbone of protection for routes that had once seemed indefensible. From the newly acquired bases, long-range aircraft swept out over waters that had previously been blind zones. Patrols operating from Trinidad, Bermuda, and the Newfoundland stations extended surveillance across regions that German commanders had treated as safe corridors. What had been unmonitored space now pulsed with American presence. Pilots reported sightings and interceptions that would have been impossible a year earlier. The Atlantic was no longer a canvas of uncertainty. It was becoming a monitored system. Convoy data told the story with a clarity no speech could match. The loss rate, which had hovered around 14% during the worst periods, began to fall steadily. Ships that would once have vanished without a trace arrived in British ports battered but intact. Each surviving convoy strengthened the industrial core of the island. Steelworks maintained their output. Factories continued assembling aircraft. Food stocks stabilized. A war effort that had once appeared fragile regrew its endurance. German naval intelligence struggled to explain the shift. Reports reaching Berlin spoke of increased escort concentrations, improved detection ranges, and a more unified operational rhythm between American and British forces. Commanders who had predicted an easy tightening of the Atlantic noose now faced a pattern they had not anticipated. Attacks required more fuel. Return routes became hazardous. The number of successful ambushes declined. For sailors on the convoys, the change was felt not in charts, but in nights that no longer seemed hopeless. The presence of additional escorts created a psychological anchor. Crews who had once stared across the black water in fear began to sense that the balance was slowly turning. The ocean remained vast, but it no longer felt abandoned. By the middle of the year, the shape of the conflict had altered. The Atlantic was not yet secure, but it was no longer collapsing. The system reinforced by the destroyers, the bases, and the expanding patrol network had reached a moment of cohesion. It was the first time since the crisis began that the future felt larger than the threat. The success of the new Atlantic system carried a weight that statistics could not soften. Behind every convoy that reached its destination stood the reality that older American destroyers, revived for a second life, demanded human endurance that often exceeded what steel could bear. Many of the ships transferred under the agreement required extensive repairs before they could sail. Crews labored through long nights to make the vessels seaworthy, knowing that each hour lost in harbor echoed across the shipping routes. For the sailors assigned to these ships, the age of the hulls was not an abstraction. It was the vibration of worn engines, the rattle of metal fatigued by decades, and the constant knowledge that a single mechanical failure could leave them stranded in waters where rescue was uncertain. In the first 2 years of service, 6 of the Town-class destroyers were lost, taken by torpedoes, storms, or structural breakdowns. Their names appeared in the daily reports not as symbols of policy, but as lives interrupted. Conditions on the Atlantic escorts were unforgiving. Young men from Britain and Canada faced winter seas that struck with the force of moving walls. Cold seeped into every part of the ship. Exhaustion lingered as a constant companion. Even when a convoy survived unscathed, sailors returned to port with faces marked by sleepless nights and the strain of decisions made under pressure no training could simulate. The destroyers offered protection, yet they demanded sacrifice in return. At the repair yards that kept the vessels afloat, the burden was no lighter. Workers pushed through 12-hour shifts to prepare ships for the next voyage, often cannibalizing parts from vessels too damaged to return to duty. Their labor rarely reached headlines. It lived in the sparks of welding torches and the constant clang of tools against aging metal. Every refitted engine, every reinforced bulkhead represented another risk postponed rather than removed. The strategy that reshaped the Atlantic did not promise fairness. It offered only necessity. The price was measured in fatigue, lost ships, and the quiet grief of families who received letters saying their sons would not return. Even victories carried shadows. The ocean had been stabilized, but it had not grown gentle. In the end, the miracle carried a human cost that no agreement could erase. When the immediate danger in the Atlantic began to recede, the significance of the destroyers for bases exchange revealed itself in ways few had anticipated. The agreement, modest on paper, became the hinge on which a new global order turned. It demonstrated that power in the 20th century did not rely solely on armies or declarations. It relied on the ability to sustain an interconnected world through finance, logistics, and the infrastructure that guarded them. The first sign of this transformation appeared in the rising capacity of the British economy. With shipping losses reduced, the island nation regained the stability needed to maintain industrial output. Over the following years, more than 30 million tons of supplies reached British ports. Aircraft factories continued operating. Shipyards remained active. Civilian life, though strained, held a fragile continuity. Britain had not escaped hardship, but it had avoided collapse, and that distinction altered the trajectory of the entire war. In Washington, the agreement shifted the philosophical foundation of foreign policy. The logic of exchanging assets created a blueprint for the program that would follow, a vast financial mechanism designed to bypass the political limitations of traditional alliances. It emerged as the Lend-Lease Act, a commitment that ultimately accounted for a significant share of American economic activity. By supplying equipment, food, and raw materials on a scale unmatched in history, the United States assumed a new role as the stabilizing force behind the Allied economies. The impact of this shift reached far beyond wartime needs. The planners who shaped the post-war settlement had watched how fragile global commerce became without coordinated financial leadership. They designed institutions that reflected the lesson. The Bretton Woods framework, the International Monetary Fund, and the early architecture of dollar-based trade all carried the imprint of the decision to tie American security to the health of global circulation. The destroyers for bases exchange had suggested that economic stability could be defended with the same determination as territorial borders. For many who lived through the crisis, the legacy was personal rather than institutional. Naval officers, shipyard workers, and policymakers later wrote about the sense that a turning point had been reached when the United States chose to act. They believed the moment revealed something essential about the philosophy of democracy, that resilience required cooperation, and that survival sometimes depended on unconventional thinking. The Atlantic did not simply reopen to trade. It reopened to a new idea of shared responsibility. The agreement's influence endures not because of the ships or the bases, but because it redefined what nations could do when the old rules no longer protected them. It offered a way to imagine power as stewardship rather than isolation, and it proved that sometimes a single decision, born of urgency, can reshape the balance of an entire world. The story returns to the Atlantic, but it is no longer the same ocean Roosevelt confronted in the summer of 1940. The water remains cold, the distances remain vast, and the risks remain real, yet something fundamental has shifted. The feeling of inevitability that once hung over the sea has faded. What was once a corridor of disappearance has become a space held together by endurance, cooperation, and a form of reasoning that broke from the habits of the past. Roosevelt's decision to exchange aging destroyers for distant bases began as an act made under pressure, but it grew into something larger than the crisis it was designed to address. It challenged the belief that neutrality could be maintained simply by standing apart. It suggested that a nation's security could be intertwined with the fate of others, even without formal alliances or shared borders. And it demonstrated that the tools of statecraft could include not only treaties and fleets, but also creativity, timing, and the willingness to recognize when the usual methods no longer applied. For the sailors who crossed the Atlantic in those years, the change was measured not in policy, but in survival. Convoys that once feared the horizon began to trust that reinforcements would arrive. Captains who had memorized the sound of torpedoes learned the sound of friendly aircraft overhead. The ocean remained dangerous, but it was no longer a place where hope felt futile. Their memories, written later in journals and letters, spoke of nights when the presence of an escort meant the difference between dread and determination. For American policymakers, the exchange marked a philosophical boundary they could not cross back. Once the nation had acted to stabilize the Atlantic, it became clear that its influence extended beyond continental margins. Decisions taken in Washington could protect factories in Birmingham, farms in Canada, and trade routes that bound continents together. The concept of security expanded from defending the coastline to sustaining the system that connected the Western world. The legacy reached into the post-war era, shaping the institutions and agreements that sought to prevent future collapses. Yet, its deeper meaning lies not in economics or infrastructure, but in the recognition that a single choice, made at the right moment, can alter the direction of events far beyond its original intent. The destroyers for bases exchange did more than shift naval power. It shifted the moral understanding of responsibility in a world where isolation had become an illusion. The Atlantic stands now as a reminder of that truth. It teaches that the difference between ruin and resilience can rest on decisions that appear improbable, even implausible, when they are first imagined. And it suggests that when the old rules fail, new ideas must rise to meet the demands of the age. If you are still listening, share with us the financial subject you hope we will decode next. Thank you.